for me personally, I was glad when I got my diagnosis. So I'll just explain a bit. I've been working with people with autism for about 17, 18, nearly 20 years. Initially working in homes for people with mental health issues, and some of them had autism who were in the homes. Then I moved into working with teens, many of which had autism, and then working with young children, many of which had autism, and then working with families, many had children with autism. So I spent years working with people with autism, and initially I didn't want any kind of label. I had started, when I was working with teens with autism, I'd started to suspect maybe I've got autism. I, as a teen myself, didn't know about the term autism at all, but I'd started, when I was doing this job with teenagers, to think the other staff used to joke about how similar I was to these some of the kids, and I used to just laugh it off, go, huh, yeah, I am. Yeah, I do that, and I do this, and I used to just laugh along with it, and initially not really take it seriously. It just was what it was. And then as time went on, I started to think, you know what, this isn't just like a one-off, you're a bit like Joe Bloggs. This is, you're a bit like that one, and that child, and that child, and that child, and that child. And it's just constantly coming up, this issue. So I started to think maybe I am autistic. I didn't really see a need for a diagnosis. I've always been reasonably assertive when I've needed to be. So if there's ever any problems, I would be assertive about those problems. When I was low paid, doing pretty much minimum wage jobs, if things got to a point where I thought, oh, sod this, I've had enough of this, I would just walk out. I would just happily quit my job there and then and disappear. Because you could just walk into the job centre, look at the wall, and in those days the wall would have little cards all over it of all the other jobs available, and you just scan across them all and think, oh, that says no experience, let's have a look, what's it paying, what's it doing, no, I can't do that, yes I can do that, and you'd find something, and then you just start a new job the next day. So it was as simple as that back at the end of the 90s, early 2000s. And so I never really thought about getting a diagnosis. Then I ended up being kind of against the idea of having a diagnosis, even though I was thinking my life would be made a little bit easier if I had one, because I was facing some workplace discrimination. I just thought, well, I see all these people who get their kids diagnosed and then they end up treating that child as the label rather than as a child, and they seem to disempower their child, which I didn't like. They would say things like, oh, he's autistic, so he can't help it, he's never going to amount to anything, he's rubbish, he's useless, he's this, he's that, and they would dismiss it and focus on all the negatives, all the struggles that child has been having. And I thought, well, the last thing I want is to have a diagnosis and then have everyone around me say, oh, he's autistic, ignore him, he's useless, he's this. So I don't want people to think that. I don't want people to have that kind of image of autism means you are this, horrible, like, negative kind of way that was being described. I didn't want that, in the same way that I didn't like the idea of, I've had depression through my life. I didn't like the idea of perhaps going to a doctor and saying, and being told, yes, you've got depression, but then having to perhaps say to others, oh yes, I suffer with depression, and have people, oh, so it means that you can't cope with life and you can't do it, when it doesn't mean that at all. So because of my therapy background, I know having depression doesn't mean you can't cope with life. It's not like you can never ever cope with anything ever again. Depression defines you. It's obviously more nuanced than that. Likewise with anxiety, all these other labels. So I became very, very against labelling. And for me personally, it wasn't until I was facing workplace discrimination that I was really, really struggling with. I was in a very well-paid job, at least for me, I thought it was very well-paid, in a very well-paid job, and all of my qualifications were in line with this one type of work, and so there was no other jobs available. You know, if I looked in all the newspapers and I looked online, there's no other jobs available for the money I was on. Most jobs were half the money I was on. No other jobs available anywhere near the money I was on that I could just leave my job and go and do. Whereas in the past, that's what I've been able to do. When I was on minimum wage, I was able to just quit the job and go and take another job, because no other job is going to be lower than minimum wage, because it's minimum wage. So it had never been a problem. But having worked up and being a middle manager and all this stuff, I was in this position where I was facing discrimination and I felt trapped. And I became very depressed and I became suicidal, and because I couldn't see a way out. And I thought, well, the only logical way out of this situation is to kill myself, because then it solves it for me. And I couldn't grasp, looking back on it now, I can think, oh, I suppose that would have upset my wife and what have you. But back then, I couldn't grasp that. As far as I was concerned, is, well, my wife would be happy because she'd know I'm no longer suffering. I'm no longer facing discrimination. I couldn't see that actually she'd be unhappy that I was no longer living. So, you know, being in that place, I thought, well, I'm going to have to seek a diagnosis, because without a diagnosis, I'm facing this discrimination for being different, for struggling with changes to routine, and for struggling with certain things that were going on. And they would have to have occupational health support involved to help me and to make sure my work environment is how it helps me to best perform doing my job. Not, you do as I say, you know, not as you want kind of attitude that I was receiving. That was me saying I want to do my job to the best of my ability, as I was doing, but I was saying, but if you make those changes, I can't do my job to the best of my ability. And so obviously I wanted occupational health to be able to say, Dan needs to keep his work environment as it is. There was no reason not to keep it as it was, other than the manager saying, I don't want it to be kept as it was, I want it changed. So there was no reason, it wasn't going to change anything by me keeping my work environment as it was. And so that's why I sought a diagnosis. So when I got the diagnosis, I was relieved. I felt relieved. I felt kind of, I can finally talk about myself honestly. So it's not like I didn't talk about myself honestly. I just talked about myself and didn't say everything. You know, I couldn't, or would end up sounding, I don't know, weird is the kind of thing people would describe me as. Or people would say, oh, you're just trying to say that you should get away with this or get away with that. And people would say all these different things. But I wouldn't be able to say, I'm autistic and that's, you know, why I'm this way. I would just have to say, I am this way. And people think, well, change, because that way isn't right. And I'd actually had a lot of people tell me that, you know, my way of thinking isn't right. And so I finally felt, you know what, I've got a label now that helps me to be able to say, this is my way of thinking and being. And it's not a wrong way of thinking and being, it's just a different way of thinking and being. And there's a label that made it more acceptable. So other people finally accepted me for who I was. Prior to having the label, people would say, would complain to my manager about me, would complain and say, you know, Daniel does this and Daniel does that, and Daniel reacts in this way and Daniel reacts in that way, and Daniel never says hello and never says goodbye. And I was getting threatened with the sack at different employments because of these different things, like not saying hello and goodbye. I actually got threatened with the sack because staff had complained to management saying he's rude, he never says hello and goodbye. It had never crossed my mind to say hello and goodbye. The end of my shift would happen and I would just get my coat, say, right, I'm off now, and I would leave. I wouldn't, and that's what I would say. I wouldn't say, goodbye, hope your shift goes well, or I wouldn't say these things that just don't come naturally to me. I'll just say, right, I'm off now, and get my coat and then leave. And then when I arrived on shift, I would just arrive on shift. I would say hi, but I wouldn't ask how, oh, hi, how's your day? I wouldn't do that part of it, the reciprocal communication-y part. And that's what people were complaining about. And so suddenly, instead of people complaining to management, by having a label, people were able to say, so Dan's like that because there's a reason for that. He's a nice enough guy, but he does these little bits that can irritate others. He's not rude, but he can be very blunt at times, and these sort of things. So some family members reacted to it by kind of trying to think, there's got to be another reason. You can't have a disability. They didn't like the idea of me having a disability. I don't think of it as a disability. I just think of it as thinking differently and being different. But some people thought, I don't want to have someone who's got a disability. Maybe it's an iron issue. Maybe he doesn't have enough iron in his diet. And so people were saying things like that to me, family-wise, when I announced I'm autistic. They would say, it must be an iron deficiency, or it must be a vitamin this deficiency, or a vitamin that deficiency. Trying to find some reason for me that if I just took a pill, that would fix me and I'd go back to, I'd be normal Dan again. And as my wife often points out, I am normal Dan. I'm the Dan that she fell in love with. Nothing has changed. It's just that some of my quirkier traits now potentially have a label that helps people to understand me better. Friends apologised. So, for example, my best friend, he's always called me Spock. His middle name is Kirk, and so he had always it just seemed to fit, Kirk and Spock. And so he'd always called me Spock, and he just felt that maybe there was something about me, there was this sort of quirky element to me. I was very logical. He'd also told me he used to get really angry about me. So behind my back, he used to get really angry that I wouldn't phone him up and I wouldn't, sort of just call up, oh, how are you? What are you up to? I wouldn't try and make contact with him at all. And yet he'd be thinking, I'm your best friend and you don't bother phoning me and you don't ask how I am and you don't seem to show an interest in me. And he had said that he used to complain about me and moan about me a lot, about that part of me. But now he feels really guilty about that because he knows that it's not me doing something out of nastiness. It's not me not phoning him because I'm a horrible person or something. It's me not phoning him because it doesn't even cross my mind to phone him. So he became very apologetic around those things. But yeah, the reactions of others were actually more interesting, I think, than my own reactions, because they were people suddenly becoming apologetic around me, or people. Some people were saying, "Oh, what's your special skill? Do you have some special talent because you're autistic?" Which I don't. I don't have any special talent. I'm me. But there's that kind of view that autistic people have special talents, as well as as part of being on the spectrum. So for me personally, I found it a relief to have a diagnosis finally, and I think diagnosis helps. I know some people say about stigma around having autism and saying, oh well, because I'm autistic, if I say to an employer that I'm autistic, then I face stigma. But actually I found the opposite, that by being able to say that I was autistic, people understood me better. Rather than discriminate against me more, it lifted discrimination, because now they could understand and think, oh, so because you're autistic, you need your work environment in this way, so we are willing to make those changes. Now, my view has always been it shouldn't take a diagnosis to have that happen. We're all human beings. We should get treated as individuals. If someone says, I don't know, I can't work, I work on a desk, a bit like me, I work on a desk in a corner with desk dividers around it, nice and isolated, I can do my job well. If you move me to the middle of an open plan office, I can't do my job well, with no desk dividers or anything. I can't do my job. It's overwhelming, too much sensory information, too self-conscious to use the phone, etc., etc. Now, that's the kind of thing I spoke about, and by having a diagnosis, it means that people listen and won't make the changes. But if I suffered shyness, I might have the same kind of thing. In the corner I did fine, I could do my job. Out in the middle, in front of everyone, I get too self-conscious and I can't use the phone and I can't use the computer and I struggle. Someone with shyness wouldn't get the help, at least where I was working. They wouldn't get the help because they suffer with shyness. And that's not right. So my view is actually the diagnosis helped me. It helped me to be able to address discrimination and lift discrimination and reduce it. But for someone else, it shouldn't be that way. It should be that the diagnosis shouldn't have made a difference. My needs should have been met as long as they weren't unrealistic. My needs should have been met regardless of a diagnosis, just like someone who's shy should have their needs met regardless of having shyness. Because having shyness, they wouldn't be able to get a diagnosis of something that could get those needs met. So that's kind of, I found having a diagnosis lifted the discrimination rather than increased it.